Chapter 12, The Reunion, Hanyu's POV. When Hanyu joined his cadre on the upper deck, Kenta made a beeline for him. "Hanyu!" he cried, grabbing him by the shoulders and looking him over. "Are you all right?" "Yes?" Hanyu blinked at his friend. "Why wouldn't I be?" "Lord Antony and Lord Marcus had a fight last night. They were both so angry when they went back to their rooms." Kenta looked up, his face pale. "I thought, well, Lord Antony didn't hurt you?" "No, not at all." So that was why I'd been so pissed off and worn out. He was even kinder than usual, in fact. He felt bad about scaring me after the battle. "What was that like?" Taiki put in. "Lord Theodora and the other gods who stayed behind on the ship put all the unattached attendants in our quarters with us and then barricaded the door. We didn't see anyone." "I want to hear about the fight," Hanyu deferred. He didn't feel quite ready to describe the strangeness and terror of that night. "You were there, Kenta?" Kenta gave a little shudder. "It was about me, actually. Lord Marcus had caught a woman in the battle, and he wanted to trade her to Lord Theodora. For me." Kenta looked like he was still a little shaken by the idea, and Hanyu wondered why. He knew his friend liked belonging to Lord Theodora, but belonging to Lord Marcus would technically be a step up, wouldn't it? And he would get to be with Asao. "I was so afraid she'd agree," Kenta said softly. "Lord Marcus made some valid points about why it would be a good deal for her. But she didn't, and then Lord Antony kept Lord Marcus from touching me, and they fought, and—" Kenta's voice was cut off by Daiji calling out, "Asao!" Hanyu whirled. Sure enough, there was his friend, gliding toward them with an attendant at his side. Hanyu broke and ran. He knew Asao wouldn't approve of the lack of decorum, but he couldn't help it. He charged over to his friend and grabbed him in a hug. "Asao!" he cried. "I'm so happy to see you. How have you—" Asao gave a soft, pained grunt. "Oh shit, I'm smashing him." Hanyu let go and stepped back. "I'm so sorry. Are you all right?" He checked his friend over and had to stifle a cry of horror at the same time that Asao said, "Yes, of course I am." Asao was pale, even paler than Hanyu would have expected from a week without the sun, and he had dark circles under his eyes. His neck wasn't bandaged where his god had drunk from him, and the puncture wounds were jagged and red. Given the noise he'd made, Hanyu wondered if he was bruised under his fine clothes. "Asao!" The others had joined them. Kenta rushed up and grabbed his hands. "Was Lord Marcus rough with you last night? I'm so sorry." "It's fine," Asao said, cutting off the other boy's apology. "I'm sure Hanyu got it just as bad. Personal service is an honor, but it has its downsides, doesn't it?" He smiled wanly and put his hand on Hanyu's shoulder and one on Kenta's. "You both know what I mean. How are you all doing? Isn't the sun wonderful today?" "Yes," Jun said hesitantly. "How are you, Asao?" "I'm doing well, truly," Asao replied. "It was simply a rough few days between the battle and the argument. Now that that's all behind us, I'm sure things will settle down again." "Of course," Kenta said. "I truly am sorry, Asao. I can't help feeling like it wouldn't have been so bad if I hadn't been there." "It's not your fault," Asao replied. "Was Lord Theodora too hard on you?" No, not at all." Kenta looked embarrassed to admit it. "She wasn't angry, just worried about me. She brewed me a cup of tea and gave me a whole armload of blankets before she went to talk to the Surgish woman." "Oh." Asao's smile wavered a little. Taiki repeated his story about being barricaded in the servants' quarters after the battle, and Asao nodded. "That was wise. Lord Marcus was quite excited that night. I wouldn't have liked to be faced with a whole group of gods. I'm sure Lord Antony was much the same, wasn't he, Hanyu?" "He scared me, yes." Hanyu had to force the words out. "He was very strange." "I know what you mean." Asao's eyes found his, and they were as cool and guarded as his tone was warm. "The love-making was intense that night." Oh! Hanyu blushed and looked down. Lord Antony hasn't yet granted me the honor of his bed. Yet." "I see." Asao looked pleased for a second, then his eyes held their usual kind, concerned softness. The change happened so quickly that Hanyu couldn't help wondering whether he'd imagined the other, almost smug expression. Sudden gentleness in his friend's face gave Hanyu the courage to ask the question that had been burning his tongue since he'd seen Asao's pelor. "Asao, are you all right? Did Lord Marcus hurt you?" Esau laughed aloud. Dear Hanyu, when did you become such a worrier? I assure you, it's nothing more than a bit of roughness. One would hardly expect a war god to be an especially tender lover. I don't mind at all. It's honestly quite thrilling. If you're ever favored with one of the gods' attention, you'll understand. Damn, of course Esau wasn't jealous of Hanyu. Why would he be? He might not belong to the Lord of the Gods as he's always expected, but he was being recognized and honored and pleasured in ways Hanyu could only dream of. He served a god that couldn't keep his hands off him. Hanyu flushed at his own stupidity. Jen was asking Esau something, probably something horrible and intrusive, but then Bunta interrupted to remind them it was time to do their exercises. Hanyu began stretching with the rest, savoring the way his body moved and his blood flowed. Would Lord Antony drink from him again soon? He assumed that the god had had plenty to eat on the night of the battle, but it had been almost 2 days since then. Lord Antony had said he wouldn't drink from him every day, but what exactly did that mean? How much would it take to hurt Hanyu? He felt a little shaky for a while after each time, but the feeling dissipated quickly. As Hanyu sweated through his push-ups, he wondered what would happen when he returned to the god's chambers. If Lord Antony went out, he would be able to get some sleep. He felt like he was growing used to the strange patchwork schedule of the ship where sleep was grabbed whenever it was convenient, regardless of the position of the sun. After a few hours of this workout, he'd be more than ready for a nice long nap. On the other hand, it had been wonderful last night when Lord Antony had stayed in the rooms with him, despite the bells announcing the departure of the sun. Even though Hanyu had been miserable over his musical failings for a good portion of the night, he'd enjoyed listening to the god's flute playing for several hours. He was an amazingly skilled player, as was to be expected of a god, Hanyu supposed, but it was still wonderful to listen to. And it had been so pleasant to sprawl on the sofa beside him as he played, quiet and companionable, and together. For the first time, Hanyu had really felt as if they were spending time together. Overall, he hoped that the god chose to stay in that night. When the sunset began dyeing the sea flame orange, he bade his friends good night, hugged a stiff Esau, and followed Bunta back down into the belly of the ship. Hanyu felt as if he was getting a feeling for the floating behemoth at this point. At least, he was fairly certain he could find his way back to Lord Antony's rooms. Nevertheless, Bunta was good company, and Hanyu enjoyed talking with him. On this journey through the ship, he learned that Bunta belonged to a god named Julia, who worked as the ship's physician. Her services were rarely needed by the gods, but frequently by the humans, apparently. She had taken Bunta in as soon as his 6 years of general service ended. Hanyu wondered if any of the gods would accept him once Lord Antony had a new offering. When the time comes, you can ask Lord Felix, Bunta advised when he voiced this worry. He arranges things for us. He'll find you a master or a work detail or both, according to your preference. He even keeps a few rooms for those who live to be too old for either work or feeding, and assigns attendants to look after them. He's very kind. I wasn't frightened at all when I approached him. Oh, good! Hanyu felt comforted at the prospect, though he hated the idea of leaving Lord Antony's rooms. He was uneasily certain that he would cry and beg to be kept, possibly cling to the god's ankles. There would be all manner of undignified displays, that was for sure. Well, that would be a problem for another day, years in the future. Maybe by then he would be mature enough to have a little self-control. Lord Felix took a human of his own recently, Bunta continued. It's Edgy, Lord Antony's last offering. He's awfully lucky. I'll bet 100 of us have asked Lord Felix to accept our service over the years. That thought kept Hanyu quiet the last few minutes' walk to Lord Antony's chambers. Of course, he'd known that he was replacing someone else as the god's attendant. Someone else had used his basin and slept in his cot and felt his master's chilly lips and piercing fangs. This Edgy had served Lord Antony for 6 years, and undoubtedly he had done a much better job of it than Hanyu. Lord Antony probably wished he could have Edgy back instead of being saddled with Hanyu. He could probably play music and everything. Hanyu was surprised by how much the thought annoyed him. He bid Bunta goodbye at the doorway, then went inside. Lord Antony was sitting at his desk writing, but when Hanyu came in and made his bow, he heard papers shuffling and drawers sliding shut. Ah, there you are, Hanyu. The god sounded pleased to see him, and Hanyu relaxed, his dour mood lightening a little. Raise your head. Tell me, have you relieved yourself lately? Hanyu was confused and goggled up at his master uncertainly. Yes, my lord? Lord Antony laughed at his gobsmacked expression. I asked because I want you to be still for a few hours now. My lord? Hanyu's stomach tightened painfully. Of all the exercises at the temple, he had hated training for stillness most. He'd spent hours kneeling in place with attendants watching and noting down every twitch and fidget. Asao had enjoyed it. He said it was calming, that if Hanyu could just center himself and quiet his mind, he'd learn to like it as well. But Hanyu never could. He'd obey, of course. He knew he owed his master that and more for keeping him after all his failings. But an order like this would just lead to more failings, more misery for him, and disappointment for Lord Antony. Tears prickled threateningly at the corners of his eyes. I'm going to paint you, the god informed him, breaking in on his unhappy memories. Now Hanyu was just confused. He opened his mouth, but shut it again when he couldn't think which question to ask first. Did his master plan to paint him all over with a different color? Or would it be designs? Should he take off his clothes? Lord Antony saw his confusion and heaved a weary sigh. I'm going to paint a picture of you. Am I correct in assuming that you've seen a painting at some point in your life? Oh! Hanyu felt the blood rush to his face. He was used to being subjected to beauty treatments, so he supposed it had been a reasonable assumption for him to make, but he still felt foolish. Worse, his master seemed to find him foolish. Sorry, my lord. Then he processed the god's words, and his jaw slackened. Wait, you want to paint me? He sputtered. Why, my lord? If you must know, that's why I chose you in the first place, Lord Antony said, matter-of-factly. I like to paint, and I wanted to paint you. Me? Hanyu grew more astonished the more the god explained. Oh, come now, boy. Lord Antony sounded almost annoyed. You and I both know you're lovely. I don't have the patience for false modesty. Lovely? Asao was 100 times lovelier than Hanyu could ever be. If Lord Antony had wanted someone lovely to paint, why on earth didn't he take Asao? That's what he should have. But then the fact remained that the god didn't choose Asao. He'd had the opportunity, and he hadn't taken it. He was a god. He knew what he wanted. Hanyu might not have been the best sacrifice, but he was the one that Lord Antony wanted. The god had chosen Hanyu over Asao, over perfect, mysterious Eiji, over all of them, and he had called him... Hanyu's face flushed, and he felt a lazy thrill curling through his body. Lovely. He said I'm lovely. He thinks I'm lovely. Lord Antony had called him pretty about 100 times the night after the battle, but that had been different. Hanyu felt as though his master would have flirted with the sofa and called it pretty that night if he hadn't been there. He simply had a surplus of interest and energy and nowhere to put it. This was different. This felt personal and meaningful and intentional in a way that made Hanyu's bare toes curl into the carpet. Of course, Lord Antony replied. Heavens, Hanyu, of course you're lovely. His voice was still brisk, but Hanyu didn't care. He felt a grin spreading over his face and suspected it was dazed and stupid-looking, but he didn't care about that either. If my Lord God says I am lovely, then I must be, he said breathily. Was he trying for flirtatious, submissive? Both, he decided, though he wasn't sure how well it came off in his voice. I was beginning to think you'd lost your ability to say more than one thing at a time, Lord Antony said. How disappointing to find I was wrong.